In today's lens review, we're going to be reviewing Canon's latest macro lens, the Canon RF 100mm f2.8 Macro IS USM. And I'm going to start right now. Now, Canon have been doing macro lenses for decades now. In fact, my very first L series lens was the previous EF 100mm macro, and I loved it for its sharpness. I thought it was one of the best lenses I owned. So what do I think of the latest RF lens, and is it worth buying? Well, let's find out in this in-depth lens review. Now, so far, I've actually liked the overall design of most RF lenses, and this lens is no exception. It's a little bit more minimalist than the previous EF 100mm f2.8, so you are missing a few features, like for instance a focus window, but to be honest, they've added so many more features, it makes it a lot more user-friendly, and I'm not worried about missing a focus window. I rarely used it anyway. So this lens has 17 elements in 13 groups, which is actually quite a complicated optical formula lens, especially when you think about it if it's a prime lens, which makes it a little bit larger and a little bit heavier. But most macro lenses have a fairly complicated optical formula, and this lens has a whopping 1.4 times magnification ratio. So to be honest, I'm not majorly fussed with that. Now, you've also got a lot of customization options as well with this lens. So you've got a focus limiter switch, which is really handy, especially when you think of the large focus throw this lens offers, as well as having an autofocus to manual focus switch. It's also got an image stabilization switch, which allows you to switch it off and on. Now, with this lens, you've also got a unique feature called a spherical aberration, or SA control, and you can minus and plus that control, and you've got it just below the main focus ring. Now, SA control basically controls the sharpness of the overall photo. If you decrease it, as you can see by this photo here, it overall softens the image. Then you've got it at 0, and then if you increase it to +1, it almost sharpens the image up, and you can really see that with the background bokeh. Now, what's also nice is you can lock it on 0 if that's something that you're not necessarily interested in. Now, you've also got a focus ring. Now, this focus ring is electronically coupled to the focus motor. It's not the most precise one I've ever used, and I'd much prefer a clutch mechanism like the previous EF 100mm, but to be honest with you, all of them are moving towards that, and the autofocus is so reliable these days, I rarely use manual focus, even when it comes to macro. And right at the top, you've also got a control ring. Now, all control rings basically allow you to change custom functions within the camera and allow you to change, for instance, ISO, allows you to change aperture. You can have it changed to anything. I personally have it changed to white balance. So when I go from an outside situation to an inside situation, it lets me change the white balance accordingly. So overall, I'm really happy with the overall build quality and the design of the lens. It also comes with weather sealing, and it also comes with a lens hood in the box, which is something I really like, especially when you think about the price point of this lens. So overall, got to give it the full marks, the 10 out of 10. Right, so let's move on to the all-important image quality. Now, macro lenses have a magnification ratio, usually higher than 1. The previous version, the EF 100mm, had a magnification of 1, where this has a magnification of 1.4, which might not seem a lot, but that's a 40% increase in size onto the sensor, which is really impressive for an autofocus macro lens, and something I really like. So what I did is I took a few photos of my desk and a few photos of objects and lenses for an upcoming video, and I say I was really impressed with the overall contrast, the colors, and also the sharpness of this lens. By far one of the sharpest lenses I have tested. It's something I really like about this lens. But of course, let's look a little bit more scientifically at the graph images. So wide open at f2.8 at 100mm. If we go ahead and zoom into the center and into the corners, the center is razor sharp. One of the sharpest lenses wide open at f2.8, where the corners are lacking a little bit in sharpness, maybe a little bit in contrast as well, but are still really sharp. To sharpen them up, all we need to do is step down to f4 or even up to f5.6, and that sharpness really does improve. And beyond that, this lens is incredibly sharp all the way to f11 and even at f16, although the image softens up a little bit just due to diffraction. So a really impressive score with this lens when it comes to overall sharpness. Right, so let's quickly move on to distortion and vignetting. Now, a distortion, almost none to be seen, a very flat profile, so very good score for this lens. Where with vignetting, there's a little bit of vignetting at f2.8, and to be honest with you, completely disappeared at f4, and that's the same situation for f5.6 and f8. So a really good score when it comes to distortion and vignetting. And the last thing we're going to look at is its macro ability. Now, this lens is really impressive due to its obviously being a dedicated macro lens with a minimum focus distance of just 26 centimeters and a maximum reproduction ratio of 1.4, which is 40% better than the previous EF 100mm f2.8. And there's also very little chromatic aberration, wide open at f2.8, at f4, at f5.6, and lastly at f8, which is really impressive. And the other thing to mention is also that SA control ring as well, which adds another customization, very little chromatic aberration when using that also. So as you can see, a very good mark with this lens, almost optically perfect. Apart from that vignetting at f2.8, to be honest with you, it's one of the best macro lenses I have tested. And also with bokeh, really good result as well. If you're planning on using this in a non-macro setting, maybe you do want to do some portrait work, the background separation is also really nice and renders that bokeh beautifully. And you can control that bokeh with that SA control ring. Grant you, it's not something I'm going to be doing, and it's after this review, probably never going to change it, just keep it in its off position. But if you're interested and you want to change some of those settings, you're more than welcome to, and that is something I really like about this lens, is the overall customization. But image quality wise, absolutely superb. A whopping 10 out of 10. Right, so let's quickly move on to the overall size and weight, and this is where there's a little bit of an anomaly. EF lenses are usually larger and heavier than their new RF equivalents, and that's been right for the 35mm, 70-200mm, and 15 to 35mm, which I've recently tested on my channel. But in this specific instance, it's actually flipped. The EF lens is smaller than the RF lens, as well lighter as well. The RF 100mm f2.8 comes in at 730 grams, where the EF 100mm f2.8 comes in at 625 grams. So it's almost 100 grams less than the new RF 100mm. It's also slightly larger as well, almost by an inch, as you can see by the size chart here. Now, I'm not saying it's a massive lens, it'll easily fit in your camera bag, but it is slightly larger and it is slightly heavier than the EF version, which is just odd, really. Most of the time, it's smaller and lighter, but in this particular instance, it's been completely flipped. So I'm not going to majorly mark it down because it is a still small and lightweight lens, but just something to think about. So overall, I'm going to be giving it an 8 out of 10 for size and weight. So next, we're going to be moving on to autofocus and image stabilization and what this lens is like for video. Now, the autofocus of this lens is actually one of the most impressive points, I think. It is incredibly fast. Macro lenses have sometimes a tendency of having quite a slow autofocus motor, but this has got dual nano USM, which actually is the very first lens in Canon's RF lineup to have this dual nano USM system, and it is unbelievably fast, almost instantaneous, and something that I'm really impressed by. Again, like I was saying, most macro lenses have a very slow focusing system, but this one is not the case, especially when you couple it with the new R5 or R6 Mark II. Now, the image stabilization is also really impressive as well, having up to 5 stops of compensation, which is great for video or if you're planning on doing some lower shutter speed work when it comes to photography. Now, for video, on the other hand, I'd also say it's really good as well. Fits onto a gimbal quite nicely, fits onto a tripod as well, but it's a bit of an odd length, so it's sometimes quite difficult to balance. But with the autofocus and the image stabilization, if you are wanting to use it for video, maybe some macro video work, highly, highly recommend it. It is really good in that particular example. So because of that, I'm going to be giving it again the full marks, the 10 out of 10. Right, so let's move on to price and what are Canon asking for all of these new and exciting features. Well, they're asking for a little bit more than the previous EF 100mm. The RF 100mm f2.8 comes in at a whopping £1,439 at the time of making this review. And I found a few second-hand options with a price range between £1,100 to £1,200. So if you are after it for a little bit cheaper, second-hand is definitely the way forward. But I must say the EF 100mm comes in way cheaper, almost £400 cheaper, coming in at £1,089. And if you're willing to look at second-hand options, I'll be able to find some decent ones between 500 to 600 quid. So a big saving. So if you're after that new 1.4 times magnification, or you just love that SA control ring, go for the RF 100mm, but you are gonna have to spend a little bit more money. But personally, I think I'm gonna stick with my EF 100mm because the image quality is just as good as the RF one, but it's just so much better value for money. So because of that, I'm gonna be giving it a 5 out of 10. Right, so let's quickly move on to the pros and cons to really work out, is this lens really worth a spot in your camera bag over the older EF 100mm f2.8? Let's look at the pros first. First thing to mention is it's got great build quality. I love the build quality and the overall design of that lens, especially if it's got that new custom control ring, which I absolutely love on RF cameras. You've also got the ability of zooming in 40% more at 1.4 times magnification over the previous EF 100mm, which is really impressive for an autofocus macro lens. And to go with that, you've also got amazing image quality, razor sharp images all the way through its aperture range. You've also got blindingly fast autofocus, which is really handy in a macro situation, although I'd find manual focus a little bit frustrating sometimes. You've also got great image stabilization, so if you're wanting to use this for video or just simply shoot in a lower lit environment with lower shutter speeds, you're still gonna get nice and sharp images. And lastly, you've got that new spherical aberration or SA control ring, which controls how your aperture is rendered. Not something I'm going to use, but you may absolutely love that new feature. So that's quite a few pros. Let's have a look at the cons of why maybe the EF lens is worth a spot in your camera bag over the new RF equivalent. First thing to note is it is larger and heavier than the EF version. Not by much, but definitely noticeable in your camera bag. And the last thing to note is it is very expensive, around £400 more than the EF 100mm f2.8. So overall, what do I think of this lens and do I recommend it? Well, the short answer is yes. I actually think this is a blindingly good macro lens. Definitely got some new features over the EF 100mm that I personally think that £400 makes it worthwhile. And if you can find it secondhand, it even narrows that gap even further. But would I upgrade from the EF 100mm? In my opinion, not really. The difference between 1 times and 1.4 times is massive, but I'm never really doing macro work at that level. I love it because I can focus on it. I'm a wedding photographer, I can focus on the ring shots and things like that, but I never use a macro lens enough to warrant upgrading it from. But if you're jumping straight into the ecosystem, I'd jump straight to this RF lens. It is definitely worth the money. Highly, highly recommend it. And with an overall score of 43 out of 50, this is a highly recommended lens and definitely worth a spot in your camera bag. Well, thank you for sticking to the end of this video. I hope you found it informative. And make sure to write down in the comments below, do you want to buy this lens or do you already own it? I'd love to hear your guys' feedback. Now, of course, if you're interested in any other lens review, I've got my playlist just up here. I also do Photoshop tutorials as well. I'll make sure to link that up here as well. I've been James for Photo Fever, and I'll catch you guys next time.